Huh, look at that. There seems to be a bit of a culture of fungus back here on the engine deck. It's a whole society right there. Wonder what's going to happen to them. Dunking it in 3, 2, 1. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Old Tank Repair. In this episode, the model in question is going to be a vintage Tamiya Jagdpanther kit. This model is another one of those builds that I built when I was much younger, and you're going to see how this model started out, as well as all of the steps and tricks that went into the model, bringing it up to the condition that we have it here. This particular model here is built for my own personal collection. It's not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these videos, I frequently take on commission build projects for models ranging between 1/35 scale and 1/6 scale. As for availability and pricing information, that information would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. Because this video will be taking you from start to finish, I will be showing many of the techniques that went into this build, bringing it up to the condition that we have it here. Because of all of this information, this will be a longer format video, so I recommend either watching this video in segments, or you can hit that little gear icon in the corner to speed it up. Regardless, let's go ahead and kick this video off. And here's the model at the start of the rebuild. This old Tamiya Jagdpanther kit was one of my adolescent builds where I went ahead and built it up to the condition that we see here and has been sitting in my old display cabinet literally ever since. Unlike many of the other OTR videos where the model in question has the elaborate backstory to it, this one here, that's not really the case. This model here I purchased from my local hobby shop back around late August or so, 1998, so almost actually around the same time as me filming this video. This model here I picked up basically when I was out on the town with my father one Saturday afternoon, and at that time these vintage Tamiya Jagdpanther kits, along with many of the other legacy kits from Tamiya, were fairly prolific and were really affordable when found. This model here I picked up anywhere between 10 to 20 US dollars, and that was really the going rate for these older kits of the period. Like I stated in many of my other videos, the 1990s was a transitional period for many of the major plastic model companies, Tamiya of course included. This particular kit here has its tooling dating back all the way to the late 1960s, so even by the 1990s period, the model was going to be woefully outdated. During the mid-90s timeframe, Tamiya themselves would step up and release a new tooling Jagdpanther kit. However, even though that Jagdpanther kit was in production and was the newest and the greatest, they still went ahead and kept on production with many of their legacy model kits. This Jagdpanther here is included. This is a tactic still incorporated by Tamiya even today. Such archaic kits that are still in production would include the M41 Walker Bulldog, as well as the Panther ausf.A. Anyway, so back to this model here. I got home from the hobby shop. The second I got in front of my workbench, I tore open the cellophane and began working on the build. This model here was completed roughly in about 2 hours time, or I should say it was ready for painting in about an hour and a half or 2 hours time. These old Tamiya kits are just insanely easy to put together. They really are. The following day, either myself or my father, I believe, painted it to the condition that you see here, and then the model is basically finished and off to the shelf it went, and that's really where it stayed all the way up until really the filming of this video. One of the reasons why I started this rebuild was because, well, one night I was perusing eBay as I usually do, and I came across these old vintage Jagdpanther kits. And to my surprise, the value on them has just shot up to honestly astronomical levels. Because these kits here are no longer in production and have not been in production for a considerable long amount of time, the quantities have been drying up, and well, these kits now have entered into the threshold of collectability. And after seeing the eBay listings for what they were, you know, I instantly thought back of this model here and the condition that it was in, and I said, you know what? I think maybe it's time I should be able to give this one some love and to build it up to a state that's, well, more appropriate compared to the original state here that I built when I was much younger. Just like with its brother, the Tamiya Panther ausf.A, This one here inherits almost all of the same quirks and inaccuracies that are present on that kit. For this one, I'm not really going to dwell too much on accurizing the model. I'm basically just going to polish it up and maybe fix one or two small things here or there. Just like with the Panther A, with this one here, it's not really worth trying to correct every single thing wrong with it. That really leads to a slippery slope to nowhere. And honestly, if you are looking for a really accurate Jagdpanther kit, this is definitely not going to be the kit for you. You might want to just stick with something that's made with newer tooling. But that's not going to prevent me from polishing this old girl off and giving it a nice once over. So let's go ahead and look closer at some of the aspects of this build, because I did make some mistakes on them when I built it originally, and these are going to be things I'm going to need to polish up and correct moving forward. Well, I was going to talk about this later, but let's go ahead and start with this now. As you can clearly see, the upper and lower hulls are not glued together and they just come apart. This was something that I've incorporated on many of my Tamiya builds with the vague aspect of possibly motorized converting them, but for the Jagdpanther here, that's not going to be the case. I'll touch upon that in a second. If anyone watched the Panther video, you'll know exactly why. However, even though I didn't glue the upper and lower hulls on, this is something that's going to be coming in handy because I do need to revise some aspects of the lower hull section. As one can clearly see, this is the exact same tooling that's recycled from the Tamiya old school Panther A. If you saw that video, again, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. This model here quite clearly is missing its sponsons, so this is going to be a bit of detailing I am going to be fabricating for this model, and I'm also going to be making some corrections to the rear section here, namely deleting and removing the motorization slots that are found on the back. While on the suspension, probably the biggest problem that I had on it was with the sprockets. If you notice, the sprockets are basically hanging on for dear life. This probably has to do with the way I mounted them to the hull. It appears I tried to melt the little plastic into a mushroom just to prevent it from falling out on the sprocket stem, but this is something that I'm going to be addressing as the build progresses. Other than that, the lower hull isn't too bad considering some of the other builds that I've showcased on the OTR lineup, and this one is pretty straightforward. The suspension, I am going to be recycling the tracks, the wheels, and all the other components, and none of those are going to change. The model here, I went ahead and appropriately deleted the sprocket teeth found on the idler wheel when I first built the model, if anyone wants to know why. Well, just like I mentioned in the Panther video, on the Tamiya old school Panther and Jagdpanther kits, the gearbox wasn't located in the front, as it should be. Instead, it was rear track driven like a Leopard or an M60. The reason why is because of this severe angle that we have here on the front. Tamiya couldn't fit the gearbox in section without messing up with this front angle, so to give it the proper front angle, they went ahead and just mounted the gearbox in the back and turned the idlers into sprockets. If you're building the tank static, you simply just amputate those little teeth off and boom, you're ready to go. Some other things to mention is that on the front section here, it looks like that fragile little tab that extends from both of these areas of the hull were broken off. That's partially why the tank, or I should say the upper section, has popped right off as easily as it did. So this is something that is going to have to be repaired. On the back section, really nothing much to talk about there. I'm not seeing any excessive glue marks or anything like that. This one, again, was such a problem-free build. I'm not seeing anything really, dramatic here, like, again, what we've seen on some of the other builds that I've already touched upon. So this leads us to the upper hull. On several sections, you can see the old glue is starting to have its effect, and the model is beginning to fall apart in some areas. Some of the tools fell off. Luckily, I was able to track them down in my display case. I have them in a little baggie that's currently off camera. On the main gun, this was actually broken, as one obviously can see. I'm not sure how this happened. Maybe the plastic just got brittle and cracked, or maybe it took an impact at some point. Honestly, I don't know, but this is definitely something I'm going to have to remedy. Headlight is clearly busted. That's going to be repaired. And on the back section here, you could see that I went ahead and glued mesh on the inside portion of the model to replicate, well, mesh work. Apparently, younger John did not realize that the meshwork on these vehicles were actually on the outside, but again, this was indicative of a bit of detailing that my father and myself were doing on these German tanks of this period. The mesh itself is just fiberglass mesh. I believe one of the other OTR videos had something similar to this, and this is going to be 1086 as the rebuild actually commences. The rear hatch is fully functional, as per the kit, and the bow machine gun fully rotates. This is not going to be altered in any way, shape, or form, and is basically going to be retained. Looking over, I can see the seam lines on the stave tube over here. This is going to be polished away, as you know, I generally do on all of my other builds. And also on the main barrel over here, there is a substantial seam that runs across both of these sections. This is something I am going to polish down. I'm on the fence if I'm going to keep the barrel or not, because as you can see, it's a bit on the warped end. I don't know if this was from me just building it or just time having effect on it. One thing about these long barrel German tanks is that the barrels can warp on them as time marches on, and I believe this might be a victim of that. So we're going to see if I'm going to be able to salvage this or if this is going to be replaced with some kind of an aftermarket piece. Which is funny because I talked about upgrading one of these other kits with an aftermarket accessories as being, you know, a fool's errand, but for something like this, I think we could all agree it would be a bit of an improvement. Well, looking at the mantlet and the mantlet well a little closer, I could see the Dremel cast texturing technique that was utilized, and being a model built from that same era, that's not too surprising. So this is something that I am going to correct. Fortunately, it's not nearly as egregious as it was on the Monogram M4A1 rebuild that I did a little while ago, and it's going to be removed in basically the same way. So at the end of the day, it's going to look much better compared to the way you see it here. And moving back, we could see that, oh, we have some fungus growing on the rear engine hatch. That's going to be fun to annihilate by throwing into the denatured alcohol. And yeah, we have here an antenna with one of my spring antenna bases, because at the time I thought, you know, all these antennas had springs on them. This is obviously scratch built, but I gotta say I did a really good job making this spring. It's a hell of a lot smaller compared to some of the other ones that I've done from models around the same period, so I guess I must have been improving. Regardless, this is not going to be surviving. Maybe I might keep the wire itself, recycle that just as a nostalgic piece, but the antenna base is going to be replaced with something a bit more prototypical. Spare track is not going to be recycled. These are probably going to be replaced with some other manufacturer's track, maybe some Dragon spare tracks that I have on hand. I did the same technique on the Panther A, and it actually worked pretty well on it, so don't be surprised if that's going to be repeated on this one here. On the rear portion, we have the fuel cap and the radiator coolant cap absent, and this is something that is found on the Panther A. On that one, I actually worked it into the build with the way I weathered it. This one, I'm not sure if I'm going to do that or if I'm actually going to make the proper covers that should go on these sections here. That remains to be seen. We'll see how that pans out as the build goes on. So that's really basically it. Oop, looks like the grill's got the message and beginning to fall off. So outside of that, the paintwork on the model here, it's all done with Tamiya acrylics, so the denatured alcohol is not going to have any sort of problems cutting through this and exposing the bare plastic again. The model, unlike some of the other ones, I don't believe is dull coated. The decals you see here are just on the surface with no additive or preservative whatsoever. So they're probably just going to wash right off as soon as the thing makes contact with the fluid. On the markings, you can see that for the crosses, for one reason or another, I went ahead and just hand painted them on as opposed to using the decals. As for why that's the case, no clue. For something like that, you're going to have to get a time machine and ask 13-year-old John what the hell he was thinking. What's interesting, though, it looks like the crosses were painted by hand as opposed to using a stencil or any other measure. So, doesn't matter. It's not going to be obviously kept. But that looks to be basically it. Well, we all know what's going to happen next. So here's the model back in the shop. At this point here, I'm going to get it ready for it to take its bath. Like I've stated in several of these videos, plastic models by their nature tend to want to float. And when you're doing a paint stripping bath, the model needs to be completely submerged so that every surface has the solution working its magic on loosening up the paint. To thwart the model from floating, we need to go ahead and weigh it down. Fortunately, for this particular example of the Jagdpanther, it's extremely easy because the upper and lower hulls can disconnect, allowing me to fill up the inside with all the necessary metal bits to weigh this thing down. Now, if this Jagdpanther had the upper and lower hulls glued together, it's a little bit trickier to go ahead and weigh it down, but fortunately, like most of the other Jagdpanthers on the market, the rear hatch is fully functional, so you could still use that as an entry point. Because this one doesn't have sponsons, this too is a nice advantage. You could squeeze stuff in from the undersides, but that's really neither here nor there for this particular example. So, with the upper and lower hulls taken apart, I could go ahead and load this thing up with as much heavy bits of scrap metal I could possibly find. Yeah, that should be enough to do it. And since there's plenty of room on the inside, I might as well go ahead and throw the Mantlet in place. The barrel popped off just with me trying to fiddle with it, see if I could fix that bend on the inside. I'm still on the fence if whether or not I'm going to salvage this, so, you know, we'll see how that pans out. But, you know, I could strip it nonetheless. It's not going to really cause any harm. The tracks, I think I'm going to leave it on. Nah, you know what, screw it, I'll take them off. So I'll go ahead and pop the tracks off. They are, of course, painted with spray paints, and the rust color is Model Master, which means it's not exactly going to have too much of effect of being removed by the alcohol, but, you know, we'll give it the old collar try, see how that pans out. Alright, now, I'm going to go ahead and put the upper and lower back together. Kind of hard to do. Alright, so, because the upper and lowers tend to want to come apart easily on this one, I'm going to add a rubber band just to keep everything where it needs to be and prevent things from floating around. So, the model's prepped, which means time for it to take its bath. And, well, it's everyone's favorite cast member for the OTR series, and that's the bucket of denatured alcohol, with the ever-increasingly thick layer of paint sludge found on the bottom. Well, before the model can go ahead and take its bath, I need to go over the court-ordered safety mandate. First, denatured alcohol is a serious chemical. You don't want to mess around with it, i.e. you don't want to get it on your skin, you don't want to get it in your eyes, and whatever you do, at all costs, do not drink it. Don't be a horse's ass with the stuff, and you should be just fine. When you're using it, use in a very well-ventilated environment like I am here, and if not, wear the proper respirators to prevent any sort of inhalation of fumes. Which, by the way, is another thing that you don't want to do. So, with all that stuff out of the way, it's time for this thing to take the plunge. Dunking it in 3, 2, 1... Just before I seal it off and have the solution do its thing, I noticed that the tin work is just barely exposed above the water line. So I'm just going to go ahead and top this off a little bit. So it's nice and fully submerged. Alright, let me go ahead and get the top and set this thing aside. So with the lid secured to the bucket, I could go ahead and move this thing to a nice secluded enclave corner in the shop, which will immensely cut down the risk of this thing accidentally getting kicked, spilling over, and creating a mess of biblical proportion. All I gotta do now is let nature run its course. I always found that these solutions work best when the model is submerged in the solution for an extended period of time. On some of the past OTR builds, I've left the model in the solution anywhere between a day to maybe 2-3 days at most sometimes. It really just depends on when I can actually get to it. However, generally on those other builds, they have been coated with a coat of Model Master Dull Coat, and because of that extra coat, a little bit extra time is needed in order for this stuff to get through the dull coat and onto the acrylic paint that's below. This one here, I'm predicting it to require less time because unlike those other builds, this one here is all painted exclusively with Tamiya acrylics, and unlike those other ones, this one does not have any sort of protective coating on it whatsoever, like dull coat or varnish or any of that stuff. So because of that, honestly, I think if I pop the lid open and start scraping away at the paint, it'll probably dislodge itself loose. But I'm not going to do that because honestly, I got other things to do in the shop today, and I really got to get at that. So this one here is just going to be placed, again, aside, and when I get to it, I'll get to it. Who knows whenever that will be.
Several days later.
Well, I think it's been sitting in this bucket long enough. So, I'm going to pop the top And let's see what we got here going on the inside. It's probably tricky to see from this camera angle, but several of the painted surfaces are flaking up, and also the decals are completely crinkled up beyond repair. I'm pretty confident that a few swipes with this stiff bristle brush here is going to make real sharp work of removing the paint. So all I got to do now is dig in, start the stripping process, but of course I'm going to need a killer soundtrack to do it to. So let's see. No. No. Perfect. Let's get this done. And here's the model fully stripped down and also broken down to its main sub-assemblies. I believe I have all the components here on the table, with maybe one or two small little parts still floating in the alcohol bath. As we saw earlier, and what's typically seen in these videos, during the paint stripping procedure, the fluid becomes so dirty and murky that it becomes impossible to find small little parts that pop off during the stripping process. However, generally these are easily tracked down. After a day or two, the sediment tends to settle on the bottom of the bucket, to which then I could go in there and fish out the missing component. Some of the other parts I was able to disassemble, like the mantlet over here. It came right off of the inner tube section. Old glue being what it is, the piece just wiggled right off. And also some of the other components popped off as well, like the side skirt mounts. Although one of them did crack, as there was just a little bit of glue left in that spot over there, and after a little bit of wiggling, it cracked prior to the glue giving way. However, the piece can be easily repaired. I'm going to be doing so shortly after the filming of this scene. We can also see the hatches for the one crew section popped off as well. And most notably, the rear plate was removed at this time. It appears that when I first built the model, I didn't install the rear plate on properly, and because of that, it was standing off-center just so slightly. Not enough to be noticed before, but when I was taking a closer look at it, when I was popping the hull back on, it just didn't line up, and it was really causing problems. So I went ahead and tried to remove it. Again, fortunately, with old glue being what it is, I was able to yank it off. However, because of the way the rear hull is designed for the motorization holes, there's not a whole lot of material on the back portion here for the rear sections of the hull, so they yanked off with the rear plate. Fortunately, I was able to wiggle them off of the rear plate without causing any problems. It was mostly a clean break, so they can be promptly re-super glued back into these locations. And once they're permanently attached, I could clean the area up and start the process of eliminating the motorization holes, and as well as fabricating the sponsons. But more information on that is to follow. On the rear plate itself, I see that I did try to drill out the exhaust manifold sections. This is something that I did on the Panther A, and this same procedure is going to be revised again for this one here. The holes were drilled, but they were crudely done. But I guess it's a precursor to what you see me doing today on my builds. Fortunately, the tubes appear to be in really good shape, so it shouldn't be too hard to just continue where I left off, only boring them out a little bit deeper. One thing that was a bit surprising, however, when the paint was removed, was that on the side here of the upper hull, as we saw before when the model was fully painted, the sides looked pretty smooth and didn't appear to have any sort of that dumb pot mark, dremel, ridiculous texturing that I've mentioned in a few of these videos and have also been a scourge on many of my older builds. Well, with the paint removed, that doesn't exactly seem to be the case, and the side here is just riddled with this dumb procedure. Same could also be said to the rear plate here. One or two small little nicks on the roof, but the front also has this present, not to mention the opposite side. This obviously is something that's not going to be kept and is going to be promptly eliminated. To do so, I had to go ahead and remove as much detailing as possible from the side hull. This will make the bodywork portion go by a little easier. Obviously, the side skirt rails were removed. This was something that were really barely hanging on in the first place, so we're going to come off regardless. But with them removed, it also makes the job easier. And you can see that I went ahead and carefully amputated the tool racks, which are on the side. One of them came off pretty easily. However, as in most cases, the one on the opposite side, not so much. It did receive some damage on it, if the camera can get into focus. And the piece is banged up pretty badly. However, I don't think this is going to be terminal, and I believe I can salvage the component here. We'll see as the build progresses, of course. With all of this equipment removed from the sides, this gives me the perfect platform in order to add the bodywork and sand everything flush. The spare track racks I did not try to remove. They seem to be glued on there really well, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to basically work around them, which shouldn't be too difficult. Another surprise that I ran into involves this little location right here. On the back of the Jagdpanther, there's a small little hatch, and that's used as a shell ejection port. And the kit originally does supply you with this component because there's a little marking molded into the plastic that tells you where the piece goes. And then on top of that, there's a little glue mark right here where I improperly mounted it. Now, I'm not sure if this component was present the whole time and only popped off during the paint stripping process, or if this piece was missing for years on end and I honestly did not realize it until really just now. So we're going to see how that pans out once the solution settles. If it's present, cool, I could, more likely recycle it and reuse it. If not, I'll probably just go ahead and fabricate a new one and drop that one in its place. I might have enough spare parts on hand in order to have this piece present. I've done a lot of these Dragon tanks, and a lot of times you have a lot of spare runners for Jagdpanther parts, so we'll see how that pans out. No point continue jaw jacking. The first thing I'm going to do, of course, though, is repair the rear portion of the hull. That is numero uno. Digging right into the rebuild takes us to the rear plate. The rear plate has been yanked off of the model since the previous scene. The reason why I had to yank it off was because when I first built the model, I actually screwed up and I didn't install it in the appropriate way. The piece was on somewhat cockeyed, and because this threw off the alignment of the upper hull. The rear plate was removed off of the model off camera. Basically, what I had to do was I had to wiggle the sections over here back and forth until the old glues gave way. This was, ironically though, the one section where the old red tube glue actually did a decent job in bonding the sections together, but this really had more or less to do with the volume of glue used as opposed to the effectiveness of the glue itself. During the removal, this section here ripped off of the lower hull and was still attached to the rear plate. This is because of this gap that we have here. This section on the back of these older Panther kits is a bit vulnerable because, again, of the smaller material found in this area over here. Fortunately, it was a clean break, so once I was able to snap the piece off of the rear plate here, I just re-CA'd it back to this section of the lower hull, repairing it back to its former glory. Once the super glue set, I went ahead and took a file and just filed down the inner sections over here where I had those really substantial areas of glue that were built up from when I first built the model. You can probably still see some traces of the glue marks remaining, but this is going to be enough for me to reinstall the component in its proper manner. Same is also true for the rear plate. I went ahead and sanded everything down so it's nice and smooth, and also the exterior portion received a bit of cleanup as well. This, of course, is easily done at this point here, as opposed to when it gets permanently affixed to the lower hull. The one revision that I made at this time was I went ahead and addressed those tick marks that are present basically on most of this model's superstructure. They were completely deleted, and as you can see, are no longer present. As for the technique, well, I'm going to be going over this in more depth as the video progresses, specifically when I get to the superstructure portion, because those little tick marks are way more prominent compared to this plate that we have here. Only thing that remains now is for me to add a little bit of cast texturing to the exhaust manifold covers, as well as also clean up the holes that I tried to drill into these sections when I first built the model all those years ago. On a similar topic, this takes us to the exhaust manifold tubes themselves. With the way the pieces are molded, you have a little bit of flash or seam lines that are present on either side of all these tube sections. This is a artifact from how the pieces are molded, and it's present on not just the old Jagdpanther kit, but obviously would be found on the old Panther A kits as well. To remove it, this was simply done with a X-Acto as well as a needle file, just going up and down these sections here, made short work of the procedure. To clean up the exhaust manifold tips, I'm going to first use a Dremel with a micro router bit. The router bit was purchased from the vendor listed below, and the size is 1.25 millimeters. I'm only going to use this bit on the two larger exhaust manifolds. These two smaller ones over here, I have to use a smaller bit because obviously this here will just chew them up and basically destroy them. To do this, I'm going to go at really slow speeds. And I'm just going to eat away at just a little bit of material here, just so it cleans it up, but also deepens the exhaust manifold, giving it more three-dimensional depth. For the smaller exhaust manifold, I'm going to be using this bit here, which is a number 63 bit, and the size is 0.0370 inches. Not sure what that is in millimeters, but again, these bits here were procured from the same vendor that I mentioned before with the router bit. And after a little swipe or two of sandpaper, the end sections are all squared off, and the holes are cleaned up and are a little bit deeper, which will give a better illusion once everything is fully painted and weathered. From this point on, this plate here can be remounted to the rear of the hull. While the putty is setting on the lower, I can now turn my attention to the upper superstructure. First thing I'm going to address are these giant knockout marks that are on the bottom portion of the fenders because, well, frankly, they just bug me. Fortunately, these are easy to polish away. I got here a Dremel with a high speed removal bit, and this will make short work of the job. In addition to the knockout marks, there's this protrusion that hangs on the bottom over here, and this was for the headlight. The same type of protrusion is also found on the Panther A, and on that build I deleted it as well. Well, with those polished off, and by the way, are a huge improvement to the model already, I'm now going to turn my attention to the other superstructure revisions. Off camera, I went ahead and took my miniature snap-off blade over here, and I went up and down the surfaces on all the areas in question. This was to smooth out any sort of remnants or burrs that were remaining on the surface from the Dremel procedure that I added to it when I first built the model. The next step is to seal and plug up all of these stupid little tick marks that are found on the sides. To do this, I'm going to be utilizing a technique that's different compared to the other old tank repair videos where I went ahead and needed to repair a similar type of situation. If anyone had seen those other videos, first, thank you for that, but secondly, on those videos I utilize red putty where I smear it onto the surface, and then I go ahead and go through the motions of doing the bodywork. For this one, however, I'm not going to be utilizing that technique. And the reason is because of the surface. On those other builds, they were basically M4 Sherman pattern of vehicles, and where this cast texturing was added, were on sections which, well, would be casted, obviously. Well, because they would be cast on the real unit, the red putty is used in order to sculpt on the cast texturing, which not only plugs up the stupid little holes, but also gives you the appropriate texturing, which would be found on the actual piece. For a Sherman, like an M4A1 for instance, that's perfectly acceptable. However, for a Jagdpanther, not so much. Obviously, these German tanks were not made from cast hull sections, they were made from rolled plate. So going with the putty technique, it's going to require more work in order to polish down and smooth out. In its place, I'm going to use the same technique that I touched upon briefly earlier with the rear plate that was found on the lower hull. And to do that, I'm going to be utilizing thick super glue. I'm going to use the super glue in lieu of the putty because it'll plug up all these little holes, and it'll also sand down and polish down easier compared to the red putty, where I'm not going to have to worry about small areas like these sections over here getting over clunked up with the red putty. In order to apply the super glue, I'm going to be utilizing my finger. Some people are going to scoff at that and want me to use disposable cheap artists, or those dumb noob brush packs that are for like 90 cents or something. I'm not. I like to use my finger. I have more control of my finger than those brushes, and if there's any super glue on my finger, I just sand it down with some sandpaper and I'm good to go. So with that in mind, I'm going to make some people cringe right now by adding the super glue. And I'm going to be utilizing a decent amount. You don't want too much on the surface, oddly enough. Just, enough to thoroughly coat everything in. You obviously want to do this in a well-ventilated area, not so much for huffing fumes, but super glue makes your eyes water, kind of like cutting onions. So that's something you want to avoid. Also, you don't want to huff it either. That's still a stupid idea. May take a few coats in order to really get it all over the surface in a smooth manner. But once it's on, you'll immediately know. And also, unlike the putty, the super glue dries in a fraction of the time. So you'll know fairly quickly if you have enough glue on the surface or not. Once the super glue sets, it's then time to begin the polishing and sanding procedure. Off camera, I went ahead and completed this side panel over here to get a good idea on what the end result is going to look like. To get a good idea on how effective this procedure was, if I hold the panel to a certain angle of light, you can see the little brown freckles popping out. These freckles are the pits that were added with the Dremel all those years ago. The reason why they're still visible at this point is because the super glue is transparent in nature, specifically after it cures and then once after it's polished down. But the surface is completely smooth. If I hold the panel a certain way in the light, you'll be able to see that there are no imperfections or blemishes whatsoever on this surface. This is going to be appreciated much more once the model gets primed, painted, and of course weathered. To show how I got to this type of format that we have here, I'll go ahead and show you how I went ahead and did the sanding procedure on the opposite side. This side here is still raw and it has all of the super glue still remaining. This is also true for the front as well as the rear plate. In order to smooth out the panels, this has to be done all by hand sanding. No mechanical method is utilized whatsoever. It's just old-fashioned elbow grease is what's going to be used to fix the problems that I have here. For the sandpapers, I'm going to be using a grab bag of different grits, starting with the coarsest stuff, which is about 150, moving my way down to 220, and then the final is going to be 400. I'm going to be using the wet sanding method throughout the entire process, which entails nothing more than dipping your sandpaper in a little bit of water, in this case my rinse for my paintbrushes, and then I just go up and down the surfaces and polish away until finally the surfaces are to a point where I deem fit. Right now, the entire side here is still raw with its super glue applied. Same is also true for the front, as well as also the rear. The procedure itself goes by pretty quickly, but of course this depends on the amount of super glue you have on the model surface. The thicker the glue, the longer obviously it's going to take to refine. This may also take 1, maybe 2 passes with the super glue in order to achieve the final look. This side here, I was able to sand it all the way down. However, when I was inspecting it in the light, I saw there were a few little cavities that remained completely visible. So what I went ahead and did was, with a second barrage of CA, I just applied it to these certain areas, wait for the CA to set. Once done, I just re-hit it again with the wet sanding method, leaving for the smooth side. A similar type of procedure might need to be executed to this side as well, but at this point it's really hard to tell since it's, still in the raw. These are the type of imperfections that pop up after the sanding is completed with your first coat, and then you'll be able to adjust accordingly at that point. So after a bit of polishing, I think I'm done with the side panel that I have here. And this leads me to why the camera is propped upward towards the ceiling, looking at my fluorescent lights. This trick works great for testing to see if your bodywork is completed. Basically, what you need to do is you need to hold your object up to the light in a certain angle. Once the light hits the surface, it's going to reflect off of it and it'll illuminate any sort of imperfections that are remaining. I use this trick on not just when I do body work like this type of procedure that I'm discussing here, but it works equally as well on 2 half barrel assemblies to check to see if the seams are fully removed. I think it's safe to say that this panel here is all set. There are a couple little tick marks towards the center and the front, but keep in mind those are the locations where the cleaning save tube and the tool rack gets remounted to the model, so I don't need to mess with those at this point. With the sides basically taken care of, this now leads us to the front and the rear. It's the same exact procedure that I just showed, only on the front and the back it requires a little bit more caution because unlike these areas here where they're nice broad flat sections that have no detailing on whatsoever, on the front and rear there's a bit more equipment here that you need to work around. It's not impossible, but it just takes a little bit more work and effort compared to large flat sections like we had on the sides. After a little bit of elbow grease, the front plate and the rear plate have been completed, and now I've been revising and finishing off the top deck. For the top, there are only a few certain little tick marks that I needed to delete and polish away, and as you can see, I've been going through the process of doing just that. Well, there are a few locations that I wanted to mention a technique to take care of because some areas are really confined and trying to get in there with some sandpaper, either with your hand, it's just not really that viable. Plus, you run the risk of causing other collateral damage to some other detail parts which don't need to be hit. To take care of small, fine pinpoint sanding like this, I went ahead and I used this technique that I have here, where I take some sandpaper, I basically bunch it up, and I grasp it in a pair of needle nose pliers or a pair of tweezers, or, something similar along those lines. Once I have the sandpaper bunched up, I flatten a section by just pressing down on it, and this here will give me more precision in going into fine areas that are really confined, but will allow me to hit just the areas that need to be addressed surgically without the need, or reducing as much as possible, the risk of hitting other detailed parts and possibly hurting the look on those. As for what that looks like in action, I went ahead and dipped the sandpaper here in some water, and you can see me go ahead and take care of some of these areas in more depth. So by just putting a little bit of pressure onto the plier itself, I'm able to concentrate the sanding on the areas that's in question. The finer the needle nose plier that you'll use, the more surgical you can get into tighter confines. This is, again, one of those little techniques that it's good to have in your little toolbox, because you don't know when something like this might come and help you out. See, these two are all taken care of. Now let me go ahead and get into these two areas over here, which have yet to been touched. So after the top deck was refined, the next area to turn my attention to are the little weld beads that I sculpted, or I should say chiseled, into the top plate area around the rims. This was utilizing the same technique that I touched upon in the other OTR videos with a Dremel, and I also had the same effects and results with this model here as I did on those other ones, which means I needed to address it much along the same ways as I've done, well, on those other builds. Luckily, the removal of the weld beads is very easily done with the use of a couple needle files. With the way the plate is on the top portion of the Jagdpanther, it sticks above these side sections ever so slightly, but this gives you a nice little perfect little 90-degree cutout in these sections over here, which aligns perfectly and acts as a guide for the needle file to go in and make its passes. After 3 or 4 passes, the little burrs from the chiseling are removed and any gouges are polished away. The gouges that are left are so small and subtle that they'll basically be covered up with the paint and the weathering, and if anything is still left visible, it kind of acts as a torch cut line, so in the end it's a win either way. So far off camera, I went ahead and utilized the needle files on the 2 side panels as well as the one here on the front. For the one on the front, I went with the square needle file, but I went in with the corner first, kind of like a diamond, and this was able to chisel and clean out the section of weld that we see here. The last section to polish up is this little portion here on the rear. And as you can see, after a few passes, the piece is completely refined, and those unsightly tick marks have been, by and large, polished away. With the bodywork completed on the upper hull, it's now time to focus on fixing up the mantlet as well as the mantlet well. Just like with the other parts, I went ahead and utilized that Dremel cast texturing that has pitted up the surfaces on both of these components. And to repair it, I'm going to utilize the same technique that I've touched upon in a few other videos. Namely, I'm going to be adding cast texturing. Now, unlike the side hull, which would have been rolled plate, for these pieces here, they would have been made from cast metal. So because of that, you are going to have a rough texture to it, which, unlike the hull where I use super glue for this, I'm going to use my red putty. For the technique, well, if anyone have seen my other OTR videos, this should look, well, pretty much copy and paste. So I'm just going to take the putty, and I'm just going to smear it onto the object with my finger in a nice, smooth, and basically even manner. You don't want to put it on too thick. You just want to have a nice little smear on. And once it's on, you want to let it dry, obviously. To get that textured effect, basically you can apply it in two manners. You can get it with the smear, like I did right over here. Or you can also add it by just stippling, by moving your finger up and down. Like I stated in a few of these videos, some people, they like to use a brush to apply this, but honestly, I have such good muscle control with my finger that it's muscle memory for me at this point. I could basically cast anything. Same procedure is also going to be done to the well as well as to the machine gun ball, which I'll cut across momentarily. With the cast texturing, drying, and about to head into its refinement point, the next thing I'm going to pay attention to, or focus on I should say, are the gun mounts that are found on the inner trunnion. The original kit supply ones were integrally molded into this unit as one integral piece. However, during the process of the rebuild, and also even just I guess with the model sitting on the shelf for as long as it has, the tabs just cracked away and are no longer present. On this build here, I want to keep the capability of having the main gun go up and down, so obviously this needs to be addressed. After looking at the piece and studying the design a little bit, I figured out the best way to make the piece have its functionality back is to, well, recreate the exact same components that were originally present on this part. And that's what we see right over here. These two little sections, here are the new fabricated gun mounts. This one here, it's still going through its refinement and its construction, and this one here, it's basically ready for installation. What I went ahead and did was I took some strips of plastruct, or I should say evergreen strip styrene, and I cut it to shape, and from here I just glued one end to the other end, making this little L-shaped type system. From here, it's going to be refined a little bit to the way you see it here, and then the way this gets mounted on, just grab my plier. It's going to be mounted directly onto the original mounts, which were cracked off on the part. In order to refine them a little bit further with a dremel, I went ahead and leveled off the cracked area, making for a nice flat surface. So when the new piece goes on, it just glues into this format that we see right here. If we notice, you're going to see this large groove found in this section, and this was necessary for the unit to pivot up and down. I don't believe this one had the capability of pivoting side to side, but the up and down feature is something that I want to keep on this model. There is something else I'm going to have to incorporate, but I'm going to be touching upon that after the mounts are fully assembled and mounted in place. After allowing a little bit of time to pass for the adhesives and the putties to dry, here you get to see what everything looks like at this point. The cast texturing on the machine gun ball, the mantlet mount, as well as the mantlet itself have been completed, and all those stupid little tick marks are a thing of the past. You can also see how the unit can fully elevate now because of those repairs that I touched upon before. At this point, the unit is not permanently attached, and I can just pop it out from the inside, which I'll touch upon in a moment. But before I do that, I need to go ahead and address the main gun. You see, like I stated before, during the project start, the main barrel did crack off on the model. Now, like I stated before, I was on the fence if I was going to polish up or if I was going to replace it outright. The barrel itself is a bit on the clunky side. I used a bit of white putty on it to take care of the seam removal, as well as some model glue, and obviously it could use for a bit of an upgrade. This piece here is salvageable. It's not too far gone. However, I came to the conclusion that rather than just trying to salvage this thing, I might as well just replace it outright. And I was on the fence of whether or not to spend money on an aftermarket barrel of one flavor or another, and is it really worth it in the end? Like I stated before, this model does have a bunch of inaccuracies to it, and does it really warrant me to dump in the extra cost of a $30 or so aftermarket aluminum barrel, which is obviously way better than the kit itself? But I didn't really feel the need to clean up this thing here. I mean, the barrel itself is fairly easily cleaned up, but this here has a bit of extra clunk on it. Again, it's not too far gone, but is it really worth the elbow grease? And I found a nice little happy middle ground. I am not going to purchase a brand new barrel, but I was also not going to keep the original barrel that this model had. Instead, I went ahead and dug through my spare parts bin and found this unit that we have here. This barrel assembly is a spare component from Dragon. This piece must have came from one of the various Dragon Panther kits that I've built, over the years on this channel. And if anyone knows a thing or two about the Dragon kits, you tend to have a bunch of spare parts from other kits in their lineup for, one piece or another, and the remainder of the parts just, aren't used. Well, this piece has that exact same story and was sitting in the spare parts bin for, God knows how many years. So instead of having this thing languish away, I decided, you know what, this will be a perfect instrument to replace the original one. The Dragon unit is far superior since it's made with more modern technology and modern molds compared to the old school one found on the Tamiya kit. It's got details on it like the little ring sections that are found right here on the end. And also the muzzle brake is not bad as well. The piece can easily be adapted to this older Tamiya kit, and this is something I'm going to touch upon in a moment. As for the Dragon piece, it is a two-part barrel assembly, just like the original Tamiya one, but on this one here you can see how I went ahead and polished away the seam lines. This was taken care of with just, thick super glue, and then I went over the surfaces with a needle file as well as some sandpaper, bringing it up to the condition that we see here. The reason why the unit is spray painted in black, well, this is twofold. First, it acts as a primer, of course, like I'm going to be touching upon later on in the video, but another reason why I like to use flat black to spray paint my two-half barrel assemblies prior to installation is because this gives me basically a preview to see how the bodywork looks. A lot of times you'll do two-part barrel assemblies, you'll polish them down, and you'll think that you're all set and ready to go until next thing you know, you have a surprise when the model goes into paint and the weathering, and you see a couple areas where the bodywork wasn't really completed, and you have some shortfall areas. In order to prevent all that good stuff from happening, it's best to go ahead and prime the barrel at this point here, so you get to see if there's any surprises, which, needless to say, on this one here, that's not the case. So to add this to the unit, I need to go ahead and adapt it to fit on the Tamiya trunnion. With the way the unit is designed, the Tamiya barrel has this inner section that sleeves onto the mantlet, and then the remainder of the barrel just emerges out from the point that you see here. In order to adapt the Dragon to fit on the Tamiya one, I need to go ahead and marry it to the section where the piece plugs into the mantlet, but it's not the portion where the mantlet can fall off of the trunnion if the piece is amputated away. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and mark this section here with a pencil. But to do that first, I want to make sure that the mantlet is fully installed properly. So you pressure fit that on, make sure you still have your free motion. And now I'm going to go ahead and mark this section here. That's why I love mechanical pencils. So with this now marked, I could go ahead and remove the unit. The way the unit is removed is you notice that on the inside portion here, there's a channel that goes up into an angle, and this is where the unit will actually pivot. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pivot the barrel assembly upward, and then push down. I should say just wiggle it a little bit. And the unit should just pop right off, or slide off of the assembly. It is a snug fit to Tamiya's credit, but, I'm going to need to take it off so I can commence with the remainder of the modification. With the mantlet off, you can see how the unit pivots on the inside, as well as you can see how it looks with those new mounts now in action. Flipping it around, I'm just going to gently slide it out, and there's the piece. When it came time for remounting the piece in, it was a bit snug at first, so what I did was I took a needle file and just loosened up some of the areas on these sections here, just to prevent any sort of snugness which can possibly crack the glue seams on these sections, which is something that would kind of be a step backward for this, rebuild. So with the little bit of material removed, the piece now slides directly in, as you just saw. With the mantlet off of the extension section, you can see the pencil line that I scribed on earlier. If I take the dragon piece and butt it up against this section, you're going to quickly see that the dragon piece extends outward about, looks like 1/8 of an inch or so, or I guess 2-3 millimeters to my metric enriched audience. So I'm going to need to go ahead and shorten the piece a little bit further down in order to compensate for this. On the dragon piece, on the tail section, you can see this little notch that's present. This notch, of course, is for the section to plug into the original dragon mantlet, and this would be submerged about, a little bit further into that section. So to compensate for that, on this one here, I'm actually going to go ahead and compensate for that by removing about another millimeter or two off of this section beyond the pencil scribe line. This is where a clean cut is going to be absolutely crucial, because depending how straight this cut is, it's going to depend on how straight the barrel is during its installation. And unless I want the thing to look like it was made by Century Arms, I'm going to need to go ahead and make sure that this cut is nice and squared away. The best way to do this is going to be on the lathe, where it will ensure a smooth, straight, square cut, as opposed to trying to do it freehand, which you're going to run the risk of having it canted. So here's the rear extension mounted on the lathe. With a pencil, I went ahead and added a line that's about 1 millimeter or so past the point that I mentioned before. This, of course, is made to compensate for the extra length found on the dragon piece. To do the actual cutting, I'm going to use this X-Acto type saw. This saw here makes a nice, fine, thin cut, and because of the blade's thickness, is not going to remove too much material from the cut section, which again will give me a nice, precise, squared off cut. When you're cutting plastic, you want to go at a nice controlled slow speed, and you want to occasionally stop what you're doing, clean off the teeth just to make sure any of those burrs don't accumulate. If it does, they could eventually melt, which can cause some problems. And there we have it. Because this section is a two-piece assembly, it is hollow on the inside, so when the piece is cut off, you are going to have a substantial hole found in the middle. In order to adapt the piece to fit, you can't just glue it on in this type of format. It'll be far too weak. So I'm going to go ahead and add a stem that emerges from the rear section of the dragon barrel. I already have the tube on hand to do that. However, to do that, I need to drill a hole directly in the middle of this section. And what better way to do that than with, well, the lathe. If I try to do this freehand, you run the risk of having the piece off center, which may lead to problems when it comes time for final installation, and the piece is going to be shifted to one side or the other. With the main barrel out of the way, the next thing to work on is the machine gun ball. The piece did bend and crack off during the paint stripping process. Now I could have possibly glued it back in place, but that type of an assembly method is pretty frail, and honestly you're just asking for the piece to get broken off on you at a later date. So what I went ahead and did was I cracked the piece off entirely, and with a pin vise I drilled into the ball here where the piece once emerged. The hole is not too deep, and so basically I'm going to take the barrel end and mounted inside the hole like you see here. Fortunately, the piece was so long that even if you lose a little bit from the rear end by it sliding into the ball, you're not losing any sort of significant length that can cause some, ding on the accuracy. And yes, I am using that term loosely on this one, but, this point still stands. Aside from that, I took the opportunity to go ahead and line this piece, the best way to put it. With the way the piece is molded, you do have a bit of a flash line running between the two. So with a needle file and some sandpaper, I simply just polished it up. While on that note, with a pin vise, I drilled out the little peephole that's found on the side of the machine gun ball, which of course would be for the optic. On the barrel itself, I went ahead and cleaned up the mold lines like I mentioned on the ball itself, and with a pin vise with a really small bit, I went ahead and drilled out the muzzle section. Again, this is one of those tricks where if you do not have the appropriate tools and the bits to do it, you might just want to sit this one out. And hopefully this comes out on camera, but you can see the muzzle end on the piece itself, and the bit that I used was this one that we have right here. Hopefully the camera goes into focus. There we go. And these bits here were acquired from the vendor listed below in the video description. With the barrel end drilled out, I'm going to go ahead and a small little drop of glue. Mount it back to its appropriate location. And then this whole unit can be reinstalled back into the model. When it locks inside, it'll find its happy little sweet spot. And then once in, the piece should not be able to pop off as it did before. With the mantlet and the machine gun taken care of, it's then time to secure the upper and lower hull halves together. Before I went ahead and did that, however, I gave the front area here a shot of primer, and I went ahead and also applied the base coat. The reason why this was done at this point is because with the Jagdpanther specifically, it's really hard to get into these little nooks and crannies in the back section once everything is fully assembled. So it's smart to do this prior to the assembly of these components, which will then prevent any sort of problems of missed paint areas once the model progresses past this point. This technique not only, of course, works on this old school Tamiya Jagdpanther here, but basically all other Jagdpanther kits that are on the market from the various companies. Off camera, I went ahead and secured the upper and lower hull halves. They basically went on in the same way as we saw earlier. Only on the rear section over here, I actually went ahead and needed to pay a little bit of attention on the way the piece locks into place. On this kit here, and I'm pretty sure the Panther A has a similar type situation, is that with that center tab, the rear piece may want to sit on in a cockeyed manner, and this is something that can hurt the look of the model. So while the glue was setting here on this tab, I went ahead and took some fine super glue, like this stuff over here, and I went ahead and just poured a small little drop into this crevice. Once it's seeped in, I just held the unit in the squared off position for the super glue to set. Fortunately, this stuff sets extremely fast, so I wasn't holding on to it for very long. Once the super glue set, the piece is at the appropriate height, and the rear hull here is exactly where it needs to be. With the upper and lower hull sections secured in place, I'm not done yet with the lower hull mods, because one thing that it's probably the biggest quirk and ding found on these old school Tamiya Panther kits is, of course, the absence of the underhull sponsons. This is something that I corrected and addressed on my Panther A, and it's also something I'm going to correct and take care of on this model here. I'm going to go ahead and show exactly how I go about doing that. To start with, I'm going to go ahead and actually use masking tape to tape up the underhull sections of the sponson. The purpose of using tape is actually going to be to come up with a template in order so I could fabricate these sections out of sheet styrene. Fortunately, the Jagdpanther isn't too tricky to do this with. The Panther A was a little bit more challenging because of that shift section found in the rear, but the Jagdpanther fortunately has the same lower hull line profile as the Panther G. So make sure that the tape is lined up nice and evenly. Okay, with that out of the way, I'm now going to grab a pencil. I'm going to start tracing over the areas where the hull lines are found. So with the lines all scribed out, I could switch this over to a different type of material where I can use to cut out the panels, and those are going to become my sponsons. For my models, I use sheet styrene. I have seen people mention and use lengths of cardboard for this type of application, which, by the way, I'm not a fan of. I hate cardboard models. I think it's ridiculous. If you're going to go ahead and go through all the work and scratch building something, it's just as easy to use sheet styrene as it is to go ahead and make it out of cardboard. Perhaps it's a cost type thing, but you know, if you're going to put the effort and time into fabricating something, use a real material like plastic as opposed to really, you know, paper, wood slurry. So with that in mind, I'm pretty sure I probably pissed off a few people with that one, but, you know, deal with it. I'm going to go ahead now and switch this over to sheet styrene. Now, for sheet styrene, you can buy, you know, just panels of it from hobby shops or craft stores, but there is a cheaper alternative, and this is a common old-school modeling trick for people who do a lot of scratch builds, and that's to use for sale or for rent signs from home improvement stores. This one I got from the Home Depot, and it comes in a gigantic panel, and because of that, it's also a lot more affordable compared to its modeling counterpart, which is, you know, does have a markup on it. So this stuff here is I believe a 1/16 of an inch thick. It's nice and thick and durable, which is perfect for this type of an application. Transfer it over. I'm not even going to go ahead and trim the tape. I'm just going to take the tape itself, put it directly onto the plastic, and now I could just use my tin snips to just cut the piece into shape. So as you can see, the panel is really close to being where it needs to be, but I am going to need to hand fit it a little bit just so it gets to the appropriate dimensions. Once this is all set, prior to gluing it in place, this one's actually going to become a template, and I could use to trace it out and repeat the process all over again. After the sponsons are squared away and polished down, it's then time to work on resculpting of the weld seams and as well as the puzzle cuts. The puzzle cuts and some of the welds were present on the model's original tooling. However, obviously with me having to nuke the surface here of all those pit marks, one of the casualties was indeed the puzzle line. So these need to be re-added. Fortunately, it's very easily done. I went ahead and with a pencil, I carefully drew in these areas, and as for the locations, I took this information off of another Jagdpanther that's in my collection in 1/35 scale, and I basically just used a caliper to copy and paste the lines as well as also the appropriate lengths. From here, I could go ahead and re-etch them. Now, to re-etch them, I'm going to be using the Dremel, and I'm going to be utilizing here this small Dremel bit. The standard drill bit here should do the job quite well, and the need for using a micro router bit is really not necessary. However, obviously that tool can do the job with the same proficiency. Both of these bits are purchased through my bit vendor, and of course I have that information listed in the video description below. To use the Dremel, basically I'm not going to be using the bit as a bit. I'm just going to be using more or less the edging as well as also the corners in order to sculpt in the weld beads as well as also to cut in the torch cut lines. This procedure goes by fairly quickly. However, it's something I'm going to be having to do off camera because when I'm doing this I like to tuck it into myself so I have some really good control of the Dremel, and this sadly is not conducive for filming. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording at this point, and we'll jump across to when all this stuff is all taken care of. So with that last detailing added, the next thing that needs to be done in order to get this guy ready for painting is to add the missing shell ejection port hatch that we have here. Like I touched upon before, the kit originally did have this bit of detailing, but for one reason or another, it was lost to the sands of time. So a new one had to have been designed. Well, I tried digging through my spare parts bin and I was unable to find any sort of part that would work for that. So I decided, you know what, let me go ahead, hit up CAD, and design a new piece and get it printed. But in addition to that, I might as well flesh out a few of the other details that are absent on the model. Obviously, this is a bit of a joke considering how simplistic and rudimentary this kit is in particular, but it's one of those situations, well, you know, why not? And that's what I have right over here on this little fret. Then let's bring the camera in closer so we get a good idea on what exactly is applied on this little piece. Now, that's a lot easier to see, if I may say so myself. Okay, so the first thing I want to mention is the shell ejection port hatch. This piece here was designed off of several real examples of Jagdpanthers that I was able to search for on the internet, and basically has all the appropriate detailing that would be found. Interestingly enough, it's probably way more accurate compared to the original hatch that was supplied with the model. The next thing that's on here, it's actually in a set of pair, are the antenna bases. The original antenna base, as I mentioned before, was destroyed, and since I didn't have any on hand, I decided to go ahead and tool one up. I took one of my 1/16 scale antenna bases, shrunk it down to 1/35, and I also simplified it a little bit, removing several of the other details that are found on that larger component. In 1/35 scale, they were not going to come out, so I just simply omitted them from the set that you see here. There's two of them in case one of them breaks during either construction or possibly during finishing. These pieces have a bad habit of getting snagged, so, you know, might as well have two on hand and keep one for a rainy day. The next thing to mention are the two filler caps. Of course, the Jagdpanther, just like the Panther and the King Tiger, have these two very large and distinguishing caps that are found on the rear deck, and these are covers where you remove that and you can get access to the fuel as well as also to the coolant tank. The Tamiya Jagdpanther has this weird quirk, and of course this carries over from the Panther ausf.A, and that's whatever example that Tamiya was studying in real life, the unit must have had these components removed for one reason or another, or, you know, was put together from a bunch of junk parts. Regardless, they are absent from the Tamiya kit, and it's probably one of the biggest dings on the Tamiya Panther A family of kits. And yes, I know Panther guys are going to be scoffing at that, but it is probably one of the bigger aspects that is a weakness on the kit itself. Regardless, I went ahead and came up with the details that you see here. As you can see, they have the appropriate geometry and detailing to them on the surface, and these should just be a direct drop-in installation, and of course, these pieces here will work on the Tamiya Panther ausf.A. In fact, the whole runner basically will, with the exclusion of the little shell ejection port, but, you know, take that for what you will. Next to the filler caps, we have here the little lifting hooks. These are going to be mounted around the fan guards, which again are another bit of iconic detailing found on the Panther family and are absent on the old school Tamiya tooling kits. These pieces here should just drop directly into place. They do have their sculpted weld beads supplied on them, so it gives them a little bit more detail fidelity compared to just having the piece like you see generally on photo etch sets, where it's just a little blade of metal that would be glued to the deck. As for the little runner itself, this here I actually have listed on the eastcoastarmory.com Shapeways store. It is printed in HD material, and again, it's one of those things that's, I'm just going to throw it out there on the market. If anybody so chooses to use this for their build or think of a reason why they would need a set like this for one reason or another, well, you know it's out there, and it can be acquired via the link listed below in the video description. And after a minute or so, you get to see what the pieces look like now secured to the model. The pieces simply remove off of the sprue and then secure to their appropriate locations. The one thing I want to mention is with the filler caps, with the way the kit is designed, you do have some very simplistic and probably easy to say amorphous detailing found in these two locations. The kit original parts need to be completely removed and amputated prior to the installation of the new replacement details. This is easily done with a Dremel and a high-speed removal bit, and if you take your time, you could easily just remove the unneeded material, and then the new replacements just drop directly over them. The hooks themselves also go into their appropriate locations, but keep in mind that the kit does not have these pieces as suggestion points, so you are going to have to double check with a reference photograph to see exactly where they go and also with their orientation. You will also probably notice that they are a mirror image, and this is something I'm going to touch upon towards the latter half of the video. But from here, the model is ready for prime time, both figuratively and literally. At this point here, the model can head off into primer, which is why I have this wire here tied across the front transmission section. This allows me to hang the unit, and then I could go ahead and apply the coat of primer, which, as many of us know, I'm going to be using flat black for this, and this is something that I've touched upon in a number of these videos at this point. So, enough jibber jabber, time to get this thing into primer, and then it can immediately slide off into paint. And here's the model now finally heading into paint and moving towards the end zone. The model, of course, has been primed with a coat of flat black spray paint. This is a technique that I mentioned in all these videos. The spray paint was applied to all of the surfaces, both on the top as well as the bottom portion, not to mention all of the running gear components as well. Also, as I typically mention, I like to use flat black for my primers because it's, one, very affordable, as well as it gives a nice surface for the base coat of whatever flavor to attach to. For my paint, I'm using exterior latex, but of course, this is also true for Tamiya, Model Master, Vallejo, so on and so forth. This may seem a bit of a no-brainer, but when you're applying paint, either a primer or a base coat, you want to make sure it's applied in nice, thin layers. This is to preserve the surface detailing and to prevent any sort of clunk up of them once the layers of paint get applied. Also, now that the model is fully painted, you can see how well the surface looks, that the pitting has been removed and sanded away. Also, you get to appreciate the sculpted puzzle sections that I touched upon before, but of course this will be even more highlighted once the model progresses past this point and gets its weathering and camouflage as well. So here's the model now in its base coat of Dunkelgelb. I went ahead and omitted me filming the application of the base coat because really is nothing much to show there that I already don't showcase in other of these OTR videos. So if you want to see what it looks like to apply a base coat, check those other videos out. So for this one though, I'm going to really focus a little bit more on the camouflage application. For the camouflage pattern, this one I'm going to be rolling with a dual tone German camouflage scheme. So this one here I'm going to be going with a Dunkelgelb and a green type camouflage pattern. For the green, there are a few color options out there. Vallejo makes a bunch. I have my own personal blend that I've used on several other German tank models that have been seen on this channel. But lately, for the last number of builds or so, I've been actually rolling with Tamiya Olive Green for the German green coloring that's been seen on a number of these recent builds. I like the way the color looks, and keep in mind the Germans did have several different shades of green as well as brown, not to mention Dunkelgelb itself, that they used throughout the war period. So it's not inaccurate to have a few different shades of green or other colors in your collection. The olive green itself, of course it's Tamiya, so it's an acrylic-based paint. This one appears to have been tainted by some kind of other color. I maybe accidentally dumped in some olive drab or something similar a number of years ago, so the color is slightly off compared to standard Tamiya olive green, but you know what, I think I can make it work for this one, and also give it a little bit more of a different look compared to, again, some of the other tanks in my collection. The next thing I want to touch upon, and this is kind of a sidetrack, but it has to do with the way these models are painted. I do get a lot of emails and questions out there from people who are looking to get into the armor modeling hobby, but they do not have the technical know-how to use an airbrush or even have the finances for a good quality airbrush or an air compressor, let alone the facilities to use one. And they ask me, what's a good starter model to get into? And generally they're looking for something German World War II because, let's face it, German World War II tanks are extremely popular. Unfortunately, one side effect is that you kind of need an airbrush when you're painting a model like this because by this point in the war, most of these German tanks did have camouflage patterns on them, and generally these camouflage patterns were applied with a spray gun of one flavor or another. Yes, there are some paintbrush patterns out there, however, these are not nearly as common as the ones that were applied with a spray gun. So if you're looking to do something German World War II, you're going to really need to invest in a airbrush, and equally as important, a good air compressor. For an airbrush, like I said before, I use a Pashi double action airbrush. In my opinion, double action is the way to go. Single action airbrushes, I've used them in the past, and honestly, they're just not that good. You can possibly get some decent results with one, but the double action does give you much greater control and better ease of flow with the paint as well as the airflow, and this again leads to a more quality job overall. In addition to the airbrush, another unsung hero is the air compressor. Now, I have touched upon this in more depth in the other videos, but basically I avoid those little hobby grade air compressors, which are basically arguably a roided up aquarium bubbler. And like I stated before, I use a more industrial air compressor, but I go into more depth on what to look for and what not to look for in those other OTR videos. So if you're interested in picking up an airbrush or leveling up your compressor, I recommend checking those out. It might be of value to you. So jumping back to the model here, specifically with the camo, the next step is to apply the camouflage pattern. And some people out there might be wondering, well, John, how do you actually go about doing this? You know, do you pre-plan things, use a photograph for reference? Do you draw the blotches out with a pencil? How do you actually do that? Well, for this camo pattern here, I'm just going to wing it. In the past, I have done both of those type of tactics. I have used several photographs for reference on occasion. If I see something I like in an illustration or probably in a photograph, you know, I'll have that on hand and I could use that as inspiration. When it comes to drawing out a camouflage pattern, that's something I really don't do. Honestly, in my opinion, it's a bit of a rookie move, you know. There are times and places where that's actually needed, like for instance with Merc camouflage schemes where you're doing a paint by number style system, in which that case, you know, the drawing everything out with a pencil is actually a bit beneficial. But for most of the other camouflage patterns out there, I basically just wing it, and I have an idea in my head and I just, you know, let it flow out of me, I guess. So that's how I personally do it. Again, you ask 10 different people, you're gonna get 10 different answers, but you're on this channel and, well, that's how I pull it off. Okay, so to get everything ready, first I want to shake up my paint as well as thoroughly stir it. This is something that can easily be mistaken. You really need to stir paint or else you're not going to get a good flow. And the way I like to stir is with a nail like I have here. You can use a toothpick. Do not use popsicle sticks. The problem with using a popsicle stick is that it's wood and it will actually absorb your paint. And it's so big that it doesn't really do a good job stirring it. A little nail, in my opinion, does the best job overall. So once the paint is thoroughly mixed, it's ready for me to pour it into the paint cup. The consistency is obviously very important, and unfortunately this isn't something that I could say on camera how thick or how thin to add it, and this is because, well, it's all done by feel. After you've done enough models and you know your airbrush equipment very well, you'll be able to have like some kind of Jedi Force trick where you can look at it and tell, oh yeah, that's too thick, or oh yeah, you know what, maybe it might be too thin. So from here, I could pour it into the cup, and it looks like it's okay. Maybe I might add a small drop or two of water to dilute it. And oh, by the way, that's the other thing. A lot of people, they like to use some fancy schmancy thinner for diluting their paint. There are some really nice acrylic thinners out there. However, me, you know, I'm archaic and old school, and I just use, well, just some tap water. And I just put a drop or two, bubble it up, and then I'm ready to go. Okay, so now that I got the paint ready, I have the airbrush hooked up to my air compressor. My air compressor is fully topped off, but don't be surprised, as the filming goes on, it's going to activate, because that's what air compressors do. And I'm not going to be talking probably at all, because I'm going to be wearing my respirator that I have right here, just so that I can protect my lungs, which I cannot stress enough. Okay, so I'm going to mask up, and now I'll be able to actually start with the application of the paint pattern. With the model fully painted and weathered, it's then time to commence with the remainder of the assembly, which would be the suspension and the running gear. Now, this is where I'm different from several other modelers out there. I've seen a lot of people out there where they like to build the model with the suspension prior to the model heading off into paint and completion, and personally, I think that is insane. It's just, I mean, there are so many little crevices on these sections over here, and trying to get them fully painted and even properly weathered is just almost, no, it's not almost, it is impossible to do when everything is fitted onto the vehicle. And that's on, you know, a vehicle like an M60 or a Patent, but on something like a German World War II Jagdpanther with the interwoven wheels, yeah, good luck with that. You know, let me know how well that works for you. Anyway, so obviously I paint everything separately from the model, and that means at some point it's going to be time for final assembly, and that's where we're at right now. In my hand here, I have a number of road wheels for one of the sides of the model. It's not all of them, there's one or two still left on the painting table, but you get an idea of what needs to be done. One thing I noticed about this particular kit, and was also something that I encountered on the Panther ausf.A, was that if you install the suspension after the model is painted, you're going to have a real difficult time with getting the components to line up appropriately. And this has to do with the layer of paint buildup on both the swing arms as well as also on the intersection of the wheels themselves. In order to get the wheels to fit onto their axles with minimum effort, what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to remove a little bit of material from these sections. The material that needs to be removed is not really any sort of plastic per se, but it's just the layers of paint that built up on the road wheels. And that's why we're at this position over here in the shop, which is my small little benchtop drill press. On the drill press, I have an 1/8 of an inch drill bit. Obviously, this size bit is really prolific and you can find just about anywhere, and it just so happens to be the exact same size of the axle hole found on all of the road wheels. To clean out the material, I'm just going to turn the drill press on and just go up and down the section over here, and even maybe wiggle it around just a little bit, not too much where you oblong the hole, just enough so that it can remove just the necessary amount of material so that the piece can fit freely. If a drill press is not something that you have in your shop, well, you can do the exact same procedure with a drill, a dremel, or even a pin vise. As long as you have the 1/8 of an inch drill bit, you can do the job. Granted, using a pin vise may take a little bit longer than using the drill press, but the point does still stand. And once you do the procedure, it's a good idea to double check to see if any more material needs to be removed on one form or one side or another. And as you can see, the road wheel just slides directly into place as it should. So now I'm going to do the exact same procedure to the remainder of the road wheels. Then we're going to come back to where I'm actually installing the wheels to this model. And this is something I want to touch upon because it can get a bit tricky on some of these older pattern interwoven wheel kits. So let's go ahead and finish up the drilling so I could go and describe in more depth exactly how to put these things on. Once all the holes are expanded on the road wheels, it's then time to start installation of the wheels themselves. And this is something that can lead to some difficulties to some beginners as well as even some intermediate builders out there when they're tackling a vehicle with this type of format. With the Jagdpanther having its interwoven wheels, the wheels need to be installed on in a certain format, and this is true for all the other tanks in this type of system, like the Tiger 1, the King Tiger, and so on and so forth. The wheels on some of the later kits that have been released in recent years, they assemble on in layers, so installing them towards the end of the build is somewhat easier compared to some of these older kits where you need to mount the wheels on together prior to the installation. So this is something that is going to be extremely relevant for anyone who's tackling some of these older pattern Tamiya kits, but also if you're the type of person who's rebuilding a Dragon or Tallery or even a modern Tamiya kit, well, since you've already did the build the first time, the wheels are already glued permanently in place, so chances are this type of system here may be relevant to your application as well. The first thing you need to do when you're securing on the wheels is that you're going to be putting them onto really the ends here of the torsion bars. So they're going to be dangling for a little bit. They're going to be hanging on basically for dear life, but it's going to be enough clearance for you to fit all the wheels in their appropriate place. Once everything is fitted, you can then just simply mount everything on in one fell swoop, getting everything where they need to be, which, by the way, is extremely important why you need to make sure that the wheels fit prior to this type of procedure. So the next thing you need to do is you need to have the proper orientation. And on an interwoven wheel tank like this, the first wheels you're going to put on are the inner wheels. So on a Panther it would be these ones here with the cone shape to them. And I could just simply slide it onto here. Now the Tamiya Panther A platform is a bit unique because you have these two large conduits running on the bottom for those plastic axles. So with this one here, I'm not sure if I'm going to really need to start with them, but we'll see how this pans out. I'm going to just go ahead and simply put them into their appropriate locations. And when it comes to these wheels, there are 4 patterns per side. So what I mean by that is you have 4 of these and 4 of the outer wheels per side. It sounds a bit confusing the first time I said it, but hopefully that clears things up. Okay, so now all 4 of the wheels are put in place. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to align them so that they are basically barely hanging on, like the way you see here. Okay, with those in position, I'm now going to secure on the outer wheels. And this is where things can get a bit tricky because you need to basically line it up with the axle like that. Just like you see there. It's a bit tricky to get on camera. Hopefully it doesn't fall off. But basically you need to do that to all of the wheels in question. So now I could fit in here the inner. The outer. Another reason why I put the inners at that time, because obviously you see me plucking them off one by one, is because it avoids any confusion on which wheel goes where. If you put the outer row wheel where the inner row wheel goes, you're going to have to redo the whole thing. Want to be careful. You don't want to rub up into the wheels too much because you could scratch the paint. So take your time. Be very careful. And I know this is adding extra time to the video, but you know what? I think it'll be worth it, specifically if anyone's working on one of these kits. And then finally, the one goes all the way on the end. So with that all lined up in place, basically just shake everything until they slide into their appropriate locations. And there we have it. So now with the wheels onto their appropriate axles, I could go ahead and secure on the poly caps that I plucked off towards the beginning of the video, but there's no real reason to get that on film. So silly me, I forgot to put on the idlers. With the way the Panther is designed, the idler actually rolls in between the last row wheel that we have there, so it would behoove you to put this on at the same time. So in order to put this one on, basically going to wiggle some of the wheels loose. At this point, the poly caps are not installed yet. And this will allow me to basically slide this guy where he needs to go. Once the idler is in place, just make sure the remainder of the wheels are seated in their appropriate manner. And here's the vehicle fully completed. Let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. starting from the bottom and working our way up to the top as I generally do, brings us to the suspension. Here you get to see what the suspension looks like, fully completed, and also with the original track mounted in place. For the weathering on the wheels, I utilize my typical techniques, which would be to mimic the look of the worn out oil leaking bearings, which is something that is quite often seen on not just heavy equipment, but military vehicles in general. As I often mention in these builds, if you are going to go with this type of a weathering technique, you want to use it like spices on your food, where you don't want to do the exact same technique on every single one of the wheels in the same locations, because then it kind of becomes overdone and it will actually detract from the look of the model. If you go ahead and you segment it out and you have certain wheels leaking while others are sweaty or not leaking at all, this is a good way to implement this technique, and it does yield for some of the best results. Not to mention, it also gives the model a bit of character, which again is another way to enhance your build. Of course, just like on all the other ECA builds, the center portion of the hubcaps are painted with a little dab of red paint, and this is common for many of the German World War II tanks of this period because these would be the Zerk fittings, and it's actually how you would lube up the center portions of the bearings. As I always state, it's a super easy thing to do. All you gotta do is paint the molding and detailing that's found on these models with a little swipe of red paint. This may be a bit tricky to see on camera, however, the idlers on these German tanks are not rubber rimmed, and so they were weathered accordingly. On the opposite end, this takes us to the sprockets. As I mentioned before, when the model was first started, the sprockets were improperly fitted, and they were basically just hanging on for dear life. Well, during the build, I went ahead and adjusted the sprockets, where instead of those wimpy little pieces of plastic holding them in place, I replaced them with a solid steel axle. The axle is much more stronger, and because of that, you'll see that the sprockets are held on in a nice, strong manner and are not dangling as they were originally. One nice trait that these older Tamiya kits have is that the sprocket shaft diameter is 1/8 of an inch, which is a really common size to find in any hardware store. Of course, this takes us to the track. The tracks that you see on this model here are the kit original tracks and are the exact same ones found on the model that was seen at the video's beginning. The tracks were simply just repainted, re-weathered to the condition that you see here, and then mounted back onto the model. Because the tracks were spray painted, the alcohol bath was not really that effective in getting the pieces stripped down. However, when I spray painted the tracks all those years ago, the application was done in a really thin and even manner. So because of that, there weren't any real big areas of clunk or impurities found on the track surface. The tracks were simply repainted, and unlike the build original where I used spray paints, for the second go around, I went ahead and used Tamiya acrylics. As I often mention in these videos, I don't like to use spray paints to paint single-piece vinyl tracks, nor do I recommend it in any way. The spray paints I found to have different formulas that vary all the time, and because of that, there is a chance that whatever chemical composition that the spray paint is composed of can potentially have a chemical reaction with the material that the tracks are made in, and this usually yields for some really bad results. To avoid this altogether, I use Tamiya acrylic paints, which are applied via the airbrush, and once applied, the tracks are in perfect condition. For the weathering work, this was done with both an airbrush as well as dry brushing to bring it up to the condition that you see it here. Just like I mentioned with the Tamiya Panther A, the top portions of the wheels have the tracks permanently glued to them. This is one way to bump up the accuracy of any Panther build, specifically ones that utilize single-piece vinyl tracks. Although this is a technique that I really hate doing, specifically on an old-school model that was originally intended to be motorized, but for vehicles like the Panther, Tiger One, and King Tiger, it is necessary. To do this technique, what you need to do is you take a small drop of super glue and you add it to the corresponding locations on the top portions of the wheels, and then you need to jig the track in place in order for the glue to set and to hold the track where it needs to be. This is best done with crumpled up balls of paper of one sort or another. You could use paper bag, tissue paper, or a paper towel, as long as it's strong enough to push the track to this location and not harm the finish. The paper is just shoved into these sections over here, and once it pushes up against the sponson, it'll push the track where it needs to go. Which, by the way, is why it's super important on these builds to have sponsons like I went ahead and fabricated earlier in this video. Once the track is secured in place, it really does improve the look of the model compared to the toyish look found on the kit original, where the track is just basically a giant oval. Moving to the rear takes us to the exhaust manifolds. As I touched upon before, they need to have been cleaned up compared to the way they were found at the beginning of the build. And now that they are fully painted and weathered, you can see just how much better they look compared to their earlier rendition. On the top portions of the storage bins, one thing I negated to talk about earlier was I went ahead and added the little hatch detailing found on the tops, and this was done with a simple piece of Plastruck strip. I just cut the piece to shape and then mounted it to the two locations. If you want to go a little bit more enhanced with the detailing, you could fabricate the little latches and the hinge mechanism, but for this build over here, the simple lids were really all that I needed to do. Onward brings us to the side hull detailing, and first we're going to mention the spare track links. As I mentioned earlier, I wasn't going to keep the spare tracks that are supplied with the model. Instead, I utilized a different source. The links you see here are made from Dragon individual Panther links that I have on hand. Obviously, I never utilize the individual links on any of my other builds for the main track assemblies, but for the spare track links that are mounted on the side, they tend to do the job fairly well. I assembled some sets and I just secured them to the original kit supplied spare track rack. This is the same procedure that I mentioned on the Tamiya Panther A video, done for basically the exact same results. You'll notice that on this side over here, I only have 2 of the spares fitted, while on the opposite side I have a full set. This was done for both aesthetic reasons to give the model a little bit more differentiation, but there's another reason. That's because with the way the stave storage tube is designed, I couldn't fit the other set into this area over here, so I just simply omitted them. With the addition of the better quality track links, this is another way that the model was enhanced from the original condition that we saw the model in at the beginning of the video. Hopping back to the other side takes to the stave storage tube. This is the same component that was seen on the model at the beginning of the build, and the kit supply piece is fairly decently rendered. The only thing I did was complete it by deleting the seams that I mentioned before. Once the seams were eliminated, the piece was simply remounted to the side of the model without any problems. On a similar note, this takes to the tool racks that are found on either side. As I touched upon before, when I had to do the bodywork on the sides of the vehicle, the tool racks needed to have been removed. I was able to carefully remove them, however, one of the racks did suffer a little bit of damage. Fortunately, the damage was not something that was irreparable, and so I made the necessary repairs. Once they were done, they were remounted to the appropriate locations, getting the model at that point ready for painting. Once the mounts were refitted in place, and after the model was fully painted and weathered, I went ahead and completed it by adding the various tools that you see here. The tools are the kit original ones. They were of course salvaged when the model was stripped down, and then once everything was fully painted and weathered, they went into their appropriate locations. Bringing us to the front plate takes to the Bosch light, which is the original kit supplied unit, and I was able to make the necessary repairs to get the piece fitted to the way we see here. As I mentioned before, may have mentioned before, this piece was broken years ago, and so in a way to fix it, I went ahead and added a little metal pin to the center portion just to prop it up and prevent it from breaking. If you break these pieces, gluing alone is not really going to work because these are always in a snag-prone location, so the addition of a small metal pin may be something to look into. Fortunately, that little pin that I added to this piece all those years ago was perfect because it not only saved this piece from getting lost to the sands of time, but I was able to simply just straighten it out and then remount it to the location that we have here, with the original metal pin being used as the main structure support. Also, while on this section over here, you really get to appreciate the weld and torch cut lines that I mentioned earlier, and the final outcome of the cast texture that I added to the MG ball as well as to the main mantlet. Jumping back to the rear engine deck, here you get to see all of the top fittings in their final form, and you really get to appreciate those 3D printed add-ons that I mentioned earlier, which of course would include the filler spout caps, the lifting hooks, the ejection port, as well as also the antenna base. For the filler spouts, I went ahead and weathered them with my usual technique of simulating fuel that has been spilled. which again is another way to add a little bit more character to your build. And this leads us to the little hooks found on the fan area. This is something, like I touched upon before, that I've seen on several examples of Panthers as well as Jagdpanthers, and some of which I believe are even still in existence today. As for why this is the case, honestly, this information escapes me at the moment. It's been a while since I really dug into Panthers and their background and stuff. But of course, if anyone knows for certain, they'll probably going to be mentioning it in the comment section listed below. While on this area, this takes me to the bump stops found on the engine hatch, and this is a Jagdpanther specific component. These two fittings over here are to protect the engine hatch from the rear hatch when it opens up. The pieces are integrally molded into this model and are found on most other 1/35 scale Jagdpanthers on the market. But no matter what make or vintage is your kit, you want to make sure that you properly paint them. These pieces are made out of rubber on the real unit, so you want to go ahead and render them in that format, which again is another way to add a little bit more extra accuracy to your build as opposed to just leaving everything over painted. One other thing I want to mention here involves the grill work for the radiators as well as the fans. On this one here, I went ahead and basically mirrored what I did on the Panther A, where I left these sections with the grenade grills absent, and this is something that's not inaccurate and is perfectly fine. The reason why I left this model without the grenade grills was because the other Panthers and Jagdpanthers in my collection have the PE fitted in place, so I wanted to add a little bit more differentiation to my collection. So on this particular example, I left them grillless. And if anybody out there is watching this video and are wondering if you can upgrade this with a set of modern photo etch grill covers, I'm pretty sure this is something that can be done. I can't say for certain, as obviously I've never added these details to one of these models, but judging by the dimensions of these parts in comparison to some of the other kits that are out there, I'm pretty confident that some of the other sets should be able to drop in place. However, that's just pure speculation, so don't quote me on that. Carrying on, takes to the rear plate area, and you get to see that spent shell ejection hatch that I mentioned earlier. Now that it's fully painted and weathered, you really get to appreciate the detailing found on that 3D printed component. And the same can also be true for the German antenna base, which of course was on that same 3D printed set. On this model here, I went ahead and rendered it antennaless, and that's because the antenna base itself is molded solid, or I should say is printed solid, and in order to drill this out to fit a wire in would just have been too problematic. So I just went ahead and made this one without the antenna fitted in place. But the antenna base itself is appropriately painted. So we have the rubber portion painted with the rubber black, and the stem, of course, with the brass. Even though this vehicle does not have an antenna on it, this, of course, does not hurt the accuracy one way or the other because these antennas were fully removable. And by rendering some models in your collection without the antennas fitted, again, is another way to add some differentiation. As for the rear hatch here, there's nothing really much to talk about. It's left completely stock, and it held up perfectly well during the rebuild process. The part is also still fully functional, however, there's no paintwork or detailing found on the inside, so there's really nothing much to add on to that. Which now leads us to the roof of this vehicle. On the roof of the model, this was the one portion of the build that required a little bit of finesse when it came to the cleanup due to all of the molding and detailing found on the top in comparison to those Dremel tick marks and those etch lines that need to have been revised. Now that the model is fully painted and weathered, you can really appreciate the work that went into this section over here, leaving for a seamless appearance. Before we depart from the top deck, one thing that I do want to mention involves the hatches. You see, the hatches on the Jagdpanther are tricky because of their shape and also because of the orientation. You see, the Jagdpanther hatch looks like it's the same type of hatch as duplicated, but there's an A and B section to each of these hatches. And to make matters worse, you can easily swap them because the hinge mechanism are exactly the same. Sometimes you can even have two of the same type of hatch on one of these holes as opposed to the other. The way to differentiate between the two is that one of the hatches have two little dimples found on these two sections, and the other ones do not. When you're building your Jagdpanther, you want to make sure that the versions with the dimples are on the left-hand side of the vehicle. This is a constant found on all Jagdpanthers. And again, it's something that someone can easily screw up with, specifically if they're just going through the motions and aren't really paying attention to the instructions and to the parts on the runner. So you want to pay attention to that. One other thing I want to mention involve these two conical shaped objects that are right here on the top. These are bump stops and work much along the same lines as the ones found here on the engine hatch. Just like the ones found on the engine hatch, I simply add a little swipe of black paint to both of these units to improve the vehicle's accuracy. Moving back to the front of the model takes us to the armament. First we have the MG34, which still retains its functional pivoting feature. The piece was painted and weathered with the same techniques that I've mentioned on other videos found on this channel. For the main armament, here you get to see the dragon barrel that I mentioned earlier. As we can recall, I went ahead and had to make some modifications to the Tamiya unit over here in order to adapt it to mount on the dragon counterpart. With the addition of the dragon piece, it really does improve the model's overall quality, and it enhances it compared to the original unit found. Of course, the original unit is salvageable, but the quality on the dragon piece is definitely superior, and that's not to be surprising because, of course, this piece here was developed in the 90s while the kit itself was developed in the late 60s and in the early 70s. And that's all she wrote with the build. Of course, this leads to the paint and the markings. As I showcased in this video, the vehicle is painted with a dual-tone German camouflage pattern, which would consist of Dunkelgelb and Dunkelgrün. The pattern was applied with the airbrush, as I showed before, and you also get a glimpse of the weathering techniques, which would include both airbrushing as well as dry brushing. One other thing I want to mention involves the barrel. Of course, on this model here, I rendered it with a primer gray barrel, which is a procedure that I've mentioned and discussed on many of my other videos. For, basically the same reasons. These gray barrels would not be something that would be uncommon on tanks in the field. If a barrel would be broken or damaged, they would swap it out, and in many cases, it would still be left in the original gray primer color. On this example over here, I really wanted to leave the barrel in the gray color because it's a way to pay tribute to that I actually did that to this model. As we can recall, and as I just mentioned, the barrel was replaced from the kit original one. So I thought it would be a really nifty feature to have the barrel with the gray coloring, as again, it was swapped out from the original unit. On the model's markings, the original decals that we saw in the beginning of the video were not salvaged, so I went ahead and found some generic German decals in my spare decal bin. The markings here, I'm not really sure on their age, their make, or even their source. I believe they may be Tamiya if I'm not mistaken, but regardless of that, the decals went onto the model without any sort of problems. They applied on really smooth, and then the entire model was sealed up with VMS matte varnish, leaving for the nice flat results that you see here. As I often mention in these videos, the VMS matte varnish is highly recommended, and it's one that I really can't recommend enough. Well, at the end of the day, I couldn't be any happier in how this build turned out. In fact, I'm not just happy, I am thrilled at the final outcome of this build. If you compare this condition to the way it was at the beginning of this project, it's hard to imagine that these two models are one in the same. These models are far more robust and are resilient compared to what some people tend to imagine. If you're watching this video, perhaps this might give you some incentive to take a look at your model collection where, you may have one that has either fallen in a sad state of disrepair or possibly just didn't turn out all that well the first time around. Well, rather than having it stay in that decrepit condition or possibly hidden away or even worse, thrown into the garbage, maybe, just maybe, you might want to take a second look at it, and with a little bit of elbow grease and with a little bit of TLC, perhaps you can polish it up into something that goes from an eyesore to something that will be a nice shining piece in your collection. Which is precisely where this one's going to be going. No longer will this model spend its days in a dark bookshelf that's found in the back enclave of my shop, where the only thing it's being used for is to be a penicillin farm. Instead, it is going into my well-lighted display room with the other builds that I've showcased on this channel in the past. One of which is a close relative of this one here, which is none other than the Tamiya Vintage Panther ausf.A. With the completion of this model over here, I now have a nicely built example of both of the vintage Tamiya Panther family kits together in the collection. Of course, the completeists out there will say, but John, you're missing the versions that are motorized with the single motor, dual motor, and even the 1968 version of the Panther with the simplistic tracks. But by and large, I'm pretty content with the two examples that I have here. Also, I definitely have interest in picking up the other Panther and Jagdpanther kits that were released by Tamiya in the years that followed, but this is something that more or less will be discussed in other potential future model showcase videos, which I may or may not already have sitting in the stash, but more information on that, of course, is to follow. And since we're on the topic of OG Tamiya German tank kits, well, I might as well invite one more to the party. Another lesson that I hope people walk away with is just because a model is made with older tooling, that doesn't mean you should discount it fully. Yes, these models here do not have the same level of quality or accuracy as some of the modern kits that are out there, but just because they're old, that doesn't mean you can't build them into something that's nice and representable. What can I say? Sometimes you gotta love the classics. And with that, I want to thank everyone for watching this episode of Old Tank Repair. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being old tank repair videos like this one over here, to the other smaller and larger scale model tank content that frequently gets posted to this channel. Another way to keep in loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been mentioned on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to check out eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again, and I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Until then.